When you think of 1850s America, what comes to mind? Maybe it's pioneers in covered wagons, gold prospectors with stars in their eyes, or a nation just bursting with potential. We love to romanticize it, but under the shiny surface of manifest destiny, there was a much darker, more lawless reality. Long before the Civil War tore the country apart, America was a hotbed of some truly shocking criminal activity. So, what were the crimes that really defined this chaotic decade? What were the offenses so widespread, so bold, that they shaped the soul of the nation? This isn't just about a few outlaws in the Wild West. We're talking about the rot that festered in the heart of the biggest cities and the corruption that reached the highest levels of power. From the brutal streets of New York's Five Points to the lawless frontier, we're counting down the 5 most shocking and widespread crimes of 1850s America. These are the stories of a time when justice was often personal and the law was fighting a losing battle. Kicking off our list at number 5 is a type of crime that doesn't need a smoking gun, but can cripple a nation from the inside out: political and financial crime. In the 1850s, America was a pressure cooker of ambition. The mad dash for land, wealth, and power created a system where the line between business and exploitation, between governing and pure graft, was dangerously blurry. At the center of it all were the political machines running America's booming cities, and none was more infamous than Tammany Hall in New York City. By the 1850s, Tammany had perfected a system of corruption that would become the stuff of legend, as waves of immigrants, especially from Ireland, flooded the city. Tammany politicians didn't see people in need, they saw votes. They'd offer up jobs, a bag of coal, or a fast track to citizenship in exchange for total loyalty at the ballot box. This wasn't charity. It was a cold, hard transaction that created a government run by loyal hacks, not by the best and brightest. Election fraud was everywhere, and it was shockingly blatant. Gangs were paid to vote over and over, ballot boxes were stuffed, and anyone who questioned the results might get a visit from some very unfriendly and very corrupt officials. The New York City mayor, elected in 1854, Fernando Wood, was the first mayor fully backed by Tammany, cementing its control for decades. Things got so bad that in 1852, the New York City Council was simply known as the 40 Thieves. But this corruption wasn't just in City Hall. It spread like a cancer through the economy, leading to one of the most devastating events of the decade: the Panic of 1857. This wasn't just a market dip. It was a crisis fueled by greed and fraud. The years before were a boom time, thanks to the California gold rush and a railroad building frenzy. It seemed like everyone was getting rich on land speculation. People would buy up huge tracts of land, often with borrowed money, betting a railroad would come through so they could flip it for a fortune. They drew up maps for hundreds of paper towns that existed only on paper and sold lots to clueless buyers. In Minnesota alone, speculators sold off nearly 5 million acres between 1855 and 1857. The whole system was a house of cards. Banks with no real oversight made incredibly risky loans. The bubble had to burst, and on August 24, 1857, it did. The Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company collapsed from massive embezzlement and bad bets. Thanks to the new telegraph, the bad news spread like wildfire. Banks failed, railroads went bankrupt, and hundreds of thousands of people lost their jobs. To make things catastrophically worse, the SS Central America, a steamship carrying 3 tons of California gold meant to save the New York banks, sank in a hurricane. The loss of that gold shattered what little confidence was left and sent the economy into a freefall. The Panic of 1857 ripped the mask off the American economy, showing just how deep the corruption and reckless gambling went. It revealed a system where a quick buck was worth more than stability, and where the powerful could play games with the fortunes of an entire country. In a time when the law was often corrupt, weak, or just plain absent, many Americans decided to handle things themselves. That brings us to number 4 on our list: mob violence and vigilantism. And this wasn't just frontier justice. It was a terrifying phenomenon that blew up in crowded cities and remote mining camps alike. Driven by public rage, prejudice, and a desperate need for order, no matter the cost. Maybe the most famous example of this didn't happen in the Wild West, but right in the heart of San Francisco. The gold rush had turned the city into a chaotic mess almost overnight. With the population boom came a crime wave and a government so corrupt it was completely paralyzed. The people felt abandoned. The breaking point came on May 14, 1856. A fiery newspaper editor named James King of William had been using his paper to expose the city's corruption. One of his main targets was a politician named James P. Casey, a man with a criminal past that King had exposed to the world. Casey, furious, confronted King on the street and shot him. That gunshot lit the powder keg. As King lay dying, a group of the city's most powerful citizens reformed the Committee of Vigilance. But this time was different. This wasn't just a posse, it was a parallel government. Led by a merchant named William T. Coleman, the committee grew to thousands of members, organized like an army. They were armed, disciplined, and ready to purge the city of the crooks and killers they believed were in charge. Ignoring the official governor and mayor, the Vigilance Committee marched on the city jail with muskets and even a cannon. They seized both James Casey and another killer, Charles Cora, after holding their own secret trials. They hanged both men from the windows of their headquarters on the very day of James King of William's funeral. For the next 3 months, the Committee of Vigilance ruled San Francisco. They arrested hundreds, deported dozens, and executed 4 men in total. They saw themselves as heroes, bringing order back to a city that had lost its way. But their critics saw them for what they were: a dangerous mob that ignored due process to deliver its own brand of brutal justice. This kind of violence wasn't just on the West Coast. In the East, it was often fueled by a different poison: nativism. The 1850s saw a huge influx of Irish and German immigrants, many of them Catholic. This stoked fear among native-born Protestants, a fear whipped into a frenzy by the Know-Nothing Party. The tension exploded with shocking brutality on August 6, 1855, in Louisville, Kentucky, day now known as Bloody Monday. On Election Day, rumors flew that foreigners were rigging the vote. Protestant mobs, riled up by a know-nothing newspaper editor, stormed through German and Irish neighborhoods with clubs, torches, and guns. They burned down an entire row of houses, destroyed a brewery, and looted businesses. People were shot dead in the street. By the time it was over, at least 22 people were dead, and many more were injured. And in the aftermath, not a single person was convicted for the crimes of Bloody Monday. It was a terrifying lesson. Whether it was the organized vigilantes of San Francisco or the hate-fueled riots of Louisville, the rule of law in the 1850s was incredibly fragile. We're deep in the lawless heart of 1850s America, and believe me, the crimes only get more shocking from here. If you're finding this dive into the nation's dark past fascinating, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's next. Now, let's get back to the countdown. On the surface, 1850s America tried to be all about Victorian morality, but underneath, it was a landscape swarming with vice. And so, at number 3, we have the sprawling world of gambling and vice crimes. From the gaslit backrooms of eastern cities to the dusty saloons of the frontier, gambling and prostitution thrived, often with the full protection of corrupt officials. The absolute epicenter of this world was New York City's 5 Points district. This neighborhood wasn't just a slum, it was a legend, a place so infamous for its crime, poverty, and disease that it became a dark tourist attraction for people like Charles Dickens and even Abraham Lincoln. The 5 Points was a maze of filthy streets and crumbling buildings. One structure, the old brewery, was said to house over 1,000 of the city's poorest people in absolute squalor. It became a symbol of the neighborhood's depravity. Now, a popular legend says that the old brewery averaged a murder a night for 15 years. While historians agree that's a myth, the fact that people believed it tells you everything you need to know about the area's terrifying reputation. For many of the Irish immigrants and African Americans living in the 5 Points, vice wasn't a choice. It was about survival. Prostitution was everywhere, from high-end parlor houses for rich merchants to the lowest cribs where women sold themselves for pennies. The area was also the battleground for notorious street gangs who controlled the local racket sand. We'll get to them very soon. But vice wasn't just a city problem. It followed the money west. The gold rush camps and rowdy river towns were magnets for professional cheats. The image of the slick riverboat gambler is an icon for a reason. These guys were masters of cards and confidence, drifting from town to town, using games like Faro and three-card Monte to fleece miners and farmers. Cheating was an art, and a game could end in riches or in violence when a loser realized he'd been had. In the mining camps, gambling was the main event. Saloons and gambling halls were often the first things built in a new town. Men would come in after months of backbreaking work with a pouch full of gold dust and lose it all in one night. These places were loud, crowded, and dangerous. Fueled by cheap whiskey and high stakes, an argument over a hand of cards could easily turn into a deadly duel. This whole shadow economy was made possible by one thing: corruption. In cities like New York and New Orleans, brothel and gambling den owners paid police and politicians for protection. Law enforcement wasn't shutting down vice. They were basically licensing it for a cut of the profits. It was a world where sin was for sale and justice was just another commodity to be bought and sold. Our number 2 crime is something that haunted the daily lives of almost everyone in 1850s. America, theft and robbery, in the crowded, anonymous cities and on the lonely, unpolished frontier. The fear of losing your property or your life for the contents of your pockets was real and constant. Nowhere was this threat worse than in the big cities on the East Coast. Before the Civil War, an estimated 3,000 homeless children roamed the streets of New York, known as street Arabs. Many of them survived by forming gangs and turning to petty crime. They were pickpockets and shoplifters, using their speed and size to vanish into the city's maze of alleyways. This was also the great era of street gangs. Groups like the Bowery Boys and the Dead Rabbits weren't just brawlers. They were organized criminal gangs. The Bowery Boys were mostly native-born and anti-immigrant, while the Dead Rabbits were their bitter rivals made up of predominantly Irish immigrants. Their feud was born from poverty and a brutal fight for control of the slums. That hatred exploded on July 4th and 5th, 1857, in the Dead Rabbits riot. What started as a street fight turned into a full-scale urban war. Hundreds of gang members battled in the streets with clubs, bricks, and pistols. They threw up barricades, and for 2 days, parts of New York were in total anarchy. The police were hopelessly outnumbered and powerless. The fighting only stopped when the state militia was called in. At least 8 people were killed and more than 100 were injured. The riot was a terrifying display of the gang's power and the city's vulnerability. Out on the frontier, theft looked different, but it was just as dangerous. The targets weren't just wallets. They were cattle, mining claims, and entire wagon trains. Highwaymen, known as road agents, preyed on lonely travelers and stagecoaches, carrying gold or bank payrolls. A long journey was a roll of the dice. Because there were no secure banks, especially in the early gold rush, miners often carried their entire fortune on them in a pouch of gold dust. This made them walking targets for robbery and murder. What connects the street kid in New York to the highwayman in California is the core reality of the 1850s, a society changing so fast that its institutions couldn't keep up. The result was a world where for thousands of people, theft wasn't just a crime, it was a career. And that brings us to the #1 crime of 1850s America. The most brutal and final act of all, homicide. If the other crimes on this list show the chaos of the era, the shocking amount of murder reveals its raw violence and just how cheap life could be. Homicide rates, especially on the frontier, were higher than anything we can imagine today, fueled by guns, booze, a weak justice system, and a culture of honor that demanded satisfaction in blood. The numbers are just horrifying. In California, during the gold rush, one study estimates that a man living in San Francisco had a 1 in 203 chance of being murdered. In some mining counties, the odds were as high as 1 in 72. For comparison, a Californian in the 1850s was on average 17 times more likely to be murdered than a resident of the state in 1999. The small town of Los Angeles, with only a few thousand people, had 40 murders in just 15 months. This was a society soaked in death. Why was it so violent? On the frontier, it was a perfect storm. The population was mostly young and male. Almost everyone carried a pistol or a Bowie knife, and arguments over cards or mining claims were often settled on the spot. And with no real law enforcement, personal revenge was often the only justice available. But the violence wasn't just in the West. A shocking murder in the supposedly civilized East could grip the entire nation. And no case shows this better than the Parkman-Webster murder trial of 1850 in Boston. This wasn't a saloon brawl. This was a crime that struck the heart of Boston's elite. The victim was Dr. George Parkman, one of the richest and most famous men in the city, a major benefactor of Harvard. The accused was Dr. John Webster, a chemistry professor at Harvard Medical College.